So, the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community fosters engaged, innovative research into placed histories across all regions and periods, from the rural to the urban and from the parish to the metropolis, with an emphasis on the localised, the micro-historical and the site-specific. We're home to projects including the Victoria County History of England and the digital crowdsourced mapping project Layers of London. We work together with others to develop imaginative new approaches to making history and to identify opportunities for history to make a difference in the real world. Today's seminar, we're going to be exploring place-based histories from the 18th and 19th century USA, featuring two School of Advanced Study PhD students, Justin Muchnick and Philip Webster, who I hope are there and just about to switch their cameras on. Fantastic, always reassuring when your speakers materialize in the virtual room. Lovely to see. So we're going to hear from both Justin and Philip in a moment. And then when the time comes, we would love you to get involved in the discussion and ask questions. If you're happy to ask your question on camera, you can use the raise hand function in Zoom. If you can't find that, if you wave for long enough, one of us will also spot you physically waving and we will come to you. If you'd prefer not to speak on camera, or if you would simply rather use this function, you can put your question into the chat box. And I'd recommend keeping the chat box open through the seminar for engaging in discussion, receiving any messages. Please, though, do hold questions until I invite them after the speakers, just in case they get lost in earlier chat. But please feel free to respond and comment on the chat during the presentations if you want to, and to post on social media if that is your thing. So we're going to move straight away to our first speaker. It's a pleasure to introduce Justin Muchnick, who's a PhD student at the Institute of Classical Studies in the School of Advanced Study, and he's also co-supervised by my colleague, Dr. Ruth Slatter, in our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, who's here today. Justin's research centres on the history of the classical curriculum at two New England boarding schools, Phillips Academy Andover and Phillips Exeter Academy. He lives on the campus of Phillips Exeter Academy, where he serves as the school's head wrestling coach. In addition to his PhD, he's at work on an academic monograph on the wrestling movie Win Win, which sounds fabulous. So Justin is going to be speaking to us today on Samuel Phillips Jr., classical education and the academy movement in 18th century New England. I'll hand over to you, Justin. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much for having me and for the introduction. I'm just going to get my screen shared so you can see my slides. Let's see.
Perfect.
How's that? Can you
That's great. Perfect.
Perfect. Great. So yeah, I'll just get started. I'm chatting about a portion of my PhD research. Let's see if I can get these slides to move. Yeah, great. So as you heard from Catherine, I'm writing a dissertation on the history of the classical curriculum at two boarding schools in New England. It's kind of an insider research-y topic because one of these schools, Phillips Academy Andover, I attended, and the other one, Phillips Exeter Academy, I currently work at and live at. Where I'm the wrestling coach here, and my partner is a Latin and Greek teacher here. So so I'm trying to kind of leverage that that insider research position to figure out some get a new angle onto these topics that have kind of been studied in some ways, but not in this particular way. So what my PhD dissertation is focusing on, these two schools, a long span of time. 1778 was when Phillips Andover was founded. 1948 was the first year in these two schools' history that neither of them required Latin or Greek of any of their students. So that's kind of the temporal bound of my dissertation. And the geographic bound scope of my dissertation, why this is kind of a local history project for a people, place, and community discussion. These two schools are really rooted in small New England towns. I've got the map pulled up here because I know it's a British audience that might be more familiar with England geography than New England geography. So Andover, Massachusetts is a town about 25 miles north of Boston, and then Exeter is about 35 miles north, or 30 to 35 miles, depending on what route you take, north of Andover. In the 21st century, super easily accessible by car, half an hour, 45-minute drive. In the time period that I'm going to be talking about today, late 18th century, these would be about a half day to maybe a full day's ride away from one another. So close enough to each other to get relatively easily from one to the other, but also sort of independent things are going on. What I'm talking about today, well, actually, I guess I'll do this to give you a little bit more background. Again, British audience, what these schools are. For an American audience, maybe they would have more resonance than the British audience. But if you don't know, there are kind of sort of three sort of buzzwords or things to think about. These schools have traditionally been rivals in sort of Harvard and Yale-y way at the secondary school level. Here's a poster from a early 20th century American football match between the two of them. They are vastly oversimplified, but you can kind of think of them in terms of an American Eton, in that they're these traditional preparatory schools that are catering to, in some ways, an elite clientele. And for those of you that are into pop culture, keep up with your movies. The Holdovers is a film that came out a couple years ago. Paul Giamatti stars in it, and it takes place on the campus of a fictional, Northeast New England boarding school. Was filmed at some of these peer institutions, not Exeter and Andover, but if you've watched that film, that's the type of school that these schools I'm looking at are. But for our conversation today, I'm focused on the late 18th century, which is this period that Theodore Sizer, still sort of the canonical authority on this era of educational history, has called the Age of the Academies. He published an influential 1964 book of the same name. And he sees the academies as a distinct form of secondary education. So education before primary school, but after primary school, but before students go off to college. And he sees it as a distinct form because in his view, these schools were broader and more quote unquote practical in their curriculum than the curriculum of the Latin grammar school, which is kind of the preceding paradigm. My research, and particularly the chapter I'm working on now, and that this presentation is kind of culled from, I'm trying to put a little bit of pressure on Sizer's notion here that the curriculum was broader and more practical at these academies than the grammar schools. And I'm looking at Andover and Exeter in particular as interesting examples because they're both very typical and influential examples of this academy movement. They were founded early in the movement, 1778 and 1781 for Andover and Exeter, and super well endowed and lasted a long time. A lot of these academies were being founded and opened and closed within the span of a schoolmaster's lifetime. But Andover and Exeter were more long-lived. So they're prime mover examples, but at the same time, they're anomalies to what Sizer sees as that broader and more practical curriculum. They were more explicitly college preparatory. They both had religious flavors that I'm happy to chat about more if I've got time for and interest in questions. But they were distinct from maybe the typical academy in certain ways. And where I'm going in this talk and talking about the broader and more practical curriculum versus maybe what we were seeing at Andover and Exeter, and in particular in this talk, Andover, it really kind of boils down to a narrative about these two collaborators who founded together, kind of came together and founded Phillips Academy in the 1770s. So Samuel Phillips on the left, the namesake of Phillips Academy, was the kind of visionary benefactor of the school. He came from a very influential and wealthy New England family. Philip Pearson on the right of the screen was the sort of day-to-day on the ground guy that implemented practically Samuel Phillips's vision. He was the first head of school, which was called preceptor back then, of Phillips Academy Andover. So these guys knew each other quite well. They were students together at what was then called the Dummer Academy, now Governor Dummer's School, a preparatory school, a secondary school in 20 miles north of Boston. And then they were classmates at Harvard College in the early 1770s. Samuel Phillips graduated in 71 and Pearson in 73. By the mid 1770s, they're both living in Andover. Actually, Pearson is boarding at the house of Samuel Phillips for a brief period of time, so they're intimately familiar with one another. They're talking a lot about education and their ideas for a plan of educating youth, and they come up with the idea that they want to start an academy. They want to create a school that's going to cater to the local and regional sort of clientele, that's going to serve as maybe a competitor to some of the existing educational options that are out there. And so when they're thinking about the curriculum of this new school, they've got one clear paradigm that they can draw from, which is the Boston Latin School, or more generally, the grammar school, the Latin grammar school. And the Boston Latin School is kind of the most prominent example of this. Boston Latin School was founded in 1635, a year before Harvard, and was kind of the most well-known of these Latin schools that, again, Sizer sees the academy as kind of breaking from. And so in this existing curricular paradigm, which I won't bore you by reading all of it, but this comes from a letter from Nathaniel Williams, who was a teacher at the Boston Latin School, to Nehemiah Hobart, who was a tutor at Harvard. And so you have to take this kind of with a grain of salt, because Williams is probably putting the best spin on what the Boston Latin School curriculum would be, because he's trying to impress this Harvard tutor and say our boys are really, really well prepared for your school. So maybe they weren't reading everything that Williams says they were reading. But 7-year program, mainly Latin, and then some Greek in the last couple of years. But quite a wide reading list, much wider than my Latin reading list was when I was in high school and even probably college as a classic student. But that was basically what it was, right? It was Latin, and then it was Greek. And that was enough to prepare you for Harvard, which was the goal of the Boston Latin School, right? So the admission requirements for Harvard in the 17 this is from 1734, but it stayed remarkably constant through the 1700s. Right, you are supposed to be able to read Tully, Cicero, Virgil, or common classical authors in Latin. You're supposed to be able to write Latin, make Latin verse, and you're supposed to be able to do a little bit of reading of Greek, like the New Testament or Isocrates, the Greek orator. So mostly Latin, a little bit of Greek, and Boston Latin did exactly that. And they were sending basically a quarter to a half of their graduating class to Harvard in this time, which was in a time where less than 0.1% of the white adult males were graduating from college. That was a remarkable record of college preparation. But when Phillips is thinking about creating a model for his new academy, Phillips Academy, he is not super enthused with the existing paradigm. So he writes this letter to Pearson, probably in 1775 or 1776. I mean, it's most likely to Pearson. It's addressed to dear friend. He doesn't say Pearson's name explicitly, but a lot of contextual clues in the letter tell us that this is probably him writing to Pearson. And this letter is his idealistic plan for what an academy education would look like. First and foremost, he stakes out the purpose of the academy. He says we don't have enough Orthodox, pious ministers. He was a staunchly Orthodox Congregationalist Christian. We don't have enough of those. We need to create a plan to educate youth to fill this ministerial shortage. That's the goal. And he says, when we're trying to do this, the way that we've been doing this, the Boston Latin paradigm, the general plan of educating youth is injudicious, is unnatural, is absurd. So he does not like what he's been seeing from the Boston Latin School in terms of preparing students that are able to take up roles in the ministry. What he writes, and now here's a big slide full of text that again I'm not going to bother to read all of it, but I'll point you to some of the important parts. So this is his argument against the Latin school curriculum. He gives kind of two arguments against the classics, and they're both kind of encapsulated in this first sentence that I put in red. In Latin, they look back to something that has been dead these 100 years and never will exist again. And if there was not a fragment of it remaining, it would not exclude us from heaven. So he says it's pointless that these kids are learning Latin. Number one, it's a dead language that's been dead for him at least these 100 years, maybe even more than, maybe he's understating there. Maybe it's been dead for more than 100 years. I don't know. But it's a dead language, so it's useless. And secondarily, or secondly, but actually probably primarily in the way that he cares about these two things. If it didn't exist, it wouldn't exclude us from heaven. It's impious writing. It's not religious. It's pagan. It's unchristian. So those are kind of his two arguments against the classical curriculum, and we see that reflected later on in his argument here, right? Latin has a great tendency to make the little ignorant scholar a pedant, which from personal experience I can say he might be spot on there, right? So useless, and must a youth's mind be poisoned with unchristian, with pagan sentiments for the sake of reading correct Latin, right? Just to get a kid to read Latin and be good at Latin, are we really gonna introduce all of this this pagan smut when we could be getting them to read Christian authors, Milton, Young, Thompson, people that write about pious Orthodox topics rather than what Ovid or Homer or whoever else is writing. So that's kind of his dual argument against the classics and towards something different. When you read this, you would think that that then they're going to be doing something completely different when the school actually opens up in 1778. But in reality, when Phillips hands things over to Philip Pearson, Phillips is watching this kind of from the wings. He actually spends most of his career in Boston doing local and state politics. He winds up becoming the lieutenant governor was a vice governor of Boston before he died. So he's occupied doing other stuff. He's still a trustee of the school, but running it day to day, at least for the first 8 years from 1778 to 1786, is Philip Pearson as the head of school and the principal instructor. And so Pearson writes this letter or this memorandum to the trustees of Phillips Academy in 1780. And this is a really great document because Pearson is describing in pretty minute detail like what he's doing basically every hour of a school day. And so from that, we can kind of piece together what the curriculum would have looked like in 1780 at Phillips Academy. He doesn't give it listed year by year like Williams did in his letter to Hobart on the Boston Latin School, but he gives it class by class basically. And so there's some English grammar, so okay, something that's not purely classical, but then pretty much everything else: Latin grammar, elementary Latin, Latin prose, Latin poetry, Greek grammar, Greek New Testament. The majority of the day is Latin and Greek, and then you've got one group of 3 students doing math. And then you've got some religious reading at the start and the close of each day from the Old Testament, the New Testament, other hymns, psalms, etc. And instead of, I guess one major difference between this and the Boston Latin School is, at least in these early years, the Boston Latin School had a 7-year curriculum that got cut down to 4 years in the 1780s. The Phillips Academy had a essentially they worked up to a 3-year curriculum, so it's a very compressed curriculum. But at the beginning in 1780, they're trying to attract as many students as they can from wherever. So it's a little bit haphazard and not as orderly or as sequenced maybe as the Boston Latin schools. But despite that, it looks really, really similar to what the Boston Latin School was doing. So in some ways, Phillips, from that first letter, if he looked at what was happening at his school, he would be like, "Whoa, this is not at all what I was thinking this would shape up to be. This looks like a mini Boston Latin School." And so the question for me is like, why is that the case? Why did the reality not reflect the vision? And a couple scholars have attempted to work toward an answer to this. Frederick Hollis, who wrote the institutional history of Andover, he says that, well, Pearson had this classical background. He was an inveterate classical scholar, which in some ways he was. He was known to be really good at Latin and Greek in his college years at Harvard, and he wound up becoming a Harvard professor in mainly rhetoric, but did teach a good amount of Latin at Harvard. So Hollis thinks, oh, Pearson really liked the classics, and he convinced Samuel Phillips somehow to go back on his initial plan because of that. Then another argument in the scholarship from Frederick Jordan, who wrote kind of a religious history of many of these boarding schools for his PhD dissertation. He says, well, we shouldn't make too much of what Phillips said. Phillips is it's the case of the age-old student haranguing against dead languages, even as they choose to recommend such to the succeeding generation. So Phillips had a bad experience learning all of this Latin and Greek as a kid. He is saying, hey, we shouldn't do this. I had these terrible experiences. But really, when you press him, he thinks, actually, no, that was a good experience, even though it was so tough. And I'm going to tell the next generation to keep doing it, even though I want to complain about how challenging and tough my own experience was. So those are kind of the two arguments. Both of those are somewhat unsatisfying for different reasons that I'm happy to talk about if you're interested in the questions. But what I found looking through some archival sources, and particularly that memorial to the trustees, if you give that a close reading, you see kind of a different picture emerging. So this is in that same memorial to the trustees. Philip Pearson is really complaining to the trustees that his school day is so heavily based in Latin and Greek, and that he's not doing stuff that he would like to be teaching. So he says that my wishes and endeavors, what he wants to do as a teacher, have been greatly obstructed by a wrong idea which both parents and children entertain of the design of the education. Parents and children who think that nothing more is intended by this education than simple grammar education, and have therefore no other object in view, and look upon anything farther as impertinent. And so he says, the mere business of teaching Latin and Greek, I regret that I have to spend all my time doing that. I wish that I could do something that was rooted in instruction, which might be of more real and lasting benefit. So the picture that emerges here is that Pearson was probably on the same page as Phillips. He wanted to teach something other than the classics, really religion, morality, inculcating pious orthodox belief. But he's getting pressure from parents and children that are looking for a simple grammar education, which grammar education we know from the Boston Latin School is education that's preparing a kid for college and particularly for Harvard. So what I think is cool or interesting or kind of speaks across the centuries in this view of why Pearson was teaching the way that he was teaching is that that it's something that I think preparatory school teachers today could probably empathize with, right? You could imagine a teacher at Phillips Academy today or Phillips Exeter or wherever This is a picture of the modern day on the left, the modern day Phillips Academy campus. This teacher wants to be teaching something of more real and lasting benefit, which for Pearson would have been religious instruction, but for a modern classroom teacher might be whatever, love of learning, love of great literature, anything. But they're getting pressure from the parents and children, right, to do something that will get their kid into college and into particularly Harvard. So here's a picture of the statue, John Harvard statue on Harvard's campus that the kids rub for good luck. They rub the foot to try to get into Harvard. And these are maybe contemporary kids that have no other object in view, anything further as impertinent. So for me, I mean, I think this is a cool little exchange or example from this early research that really has some modern resonance. A lot of stuff that I do in my project, I'm looking at stuff that feels, past as a foreign country and has no bearing on the stuff that I'm seeing when I walk out of my door and look at what these schools look like today. But I thought I'd share this with you because it's one of these moments where actually Pearson might have found himself in the teachers' lounge today with some of these teachers maybe having a lot to talk about. So that's my talk. I've got some references for the reading if you're interested. And at the end, after we hear from Philip, if there are questions or anything on this in particular, or boarding schools in the 18th, 19th century in general, I'm happy to chat about them. So thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Justin. Thank you. That was fascinating. Wonderful. Thank you. Great to see a kind of a slightly different inflection of local history there. And I really enjoyed the contemporary resonance. It's interesting to see how the curriculum has always been a battleground and continues to be so. I can already see lots of interesting potential intersections with Philip's research emerging. So I'll ask you, Justin, to finish sharing your screen, and I'll ask Philip for you to start sharing your slides as I introduce you. So it's a pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Philip Webster. Philip joined Thomas More University in Kentucky in autumn 2023 as an assistant professor and the director of theatre. He's also the founder and managing director of South Bank Shakespeare, which provides free outdoor Shakespeare productions to northern Kentucky's river cities. In addition to his work as a musician, actor, and director, Webster is a United States Air Force veteran and spent 4 years serving as an Arabic language analyst. Quite a polymath. Upon leaving military service, he earned an MBA from the University of Maryland, focusing on entrepreneurship and innovation in the creative sector. He holds a BFA in theatre performance from Northern Kentucky University and an MA in world theatre from Aberystwyth. He's currently a doctoral student at the Institute of Historical Research, where he's supervised by me and my colleague, Dr. Justin Colson, who's also here this evening. And he's writing a dissertation on the endlessly fascinating and mostly forgotten Pike's Opera House in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's actually Philip's birthday today. He couldn't think of a better way to celebrate than to be here giving the seminar paper. So maybe we should all sing to him after his paper. I don't know. Anyway, he will be speaking to us on Alice's Wonderland, Alice Pike Barney, toy theatres, and ludic exploration of dramatic space in 19th century Cincinnati. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you for that fantastic introduction. Is it shared properly on your end?
Yes,
Okay.
It is. Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you all for zooming in with me on my birthday. I know that's why you're all here and not for this lovely talk on toy theaters. But yeah, let's get into it. So this is Pike's Opera House. It was built by the whiskey merchant Samuel Pike in Cincinnati in 1859 and was one of the grandest venues ever constructed in the United States. Unfortunately, it burned down just 7 years after its opening, leaving virtually no material remains and scant documentary or visual evidence of its environs. It quickly faded from the collective memory of Cincinnatians and is little more than a footnote in the history of what was at the time one of America's largest cities. Now, my wider PhD research asks the question, is it possible to experience Pikes again? to reconstruct the building or the stage and reenact its performances. Well, with enough money and political will, anything's possible. But the complexity and cost of traditional reconstruction efforts, like Shakespeare's Globe, or digital approaches, like the Visualizing Lost Theaters project, leave little room for participating in the reconstruction outside of a small circle of scholars and technical experts. But by taking an expansive, creative approach to what reconstruction and reenactment can be, I propose that utilizing 19th century methods of extending the theatrical experience, for example, through toy theaters, parlor theatricals, and even scrapbooks, one can facilitate the creation of immersive experiential reimaginings of lost performance spaces that are both widely accessible and participatory. So today we'll be looking at one of these forms of reconstruction, toy theaters. Now, what exactly does a toy theater reconstruction look like? More importantly, how can they help us rebuild Pike's Opera House? So toy theaters, especially as they were developed in 19th century in London, were in many ways a reflection of the commercial grown-up theater. But to engage with a toy theater isn't simply creating a scale model. Theater historian Nicole Sherrico writes that toy theater does not reproduce human theater so much as it repurposes basic elements of that theater in order to produce new avenues for participating in and contributing to theatrical culture. It invites an engagement with theatrical performance that goes beyond spectatorship. It's this experience, the set of activities in which theater goers engage with performances beyond spectatorship, that I attempt to recreate. The ways in which the Opera House and the performances it hosted inspired creative restagings and reenactments in the parlors and playrooms of Cincinnati. So today we're going to look at a couple of the examples that I've been working on, some of the practical research projects I've undertaken to better understand and explore these concepts. The first is my attempt to emulate the youthful play of the noted painter and philanthropist Alice Pike Barney, who was the daughter of the Opera House owner. And her toy theater, as she might have created it in Cincinnati circa 1863 when she was 6 years old. I explore how she might have reconstructed the Pike stage and reenacted a performance of a failed adaptation of James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans that was written by and starring the infamous actress and author Ada Isaacs Menken, which had one of its only performances ever at Pike's Opera House in 1863. Now, there is, however, a dearth of contemporaneous accounts on how toy theaters were actually played with, and few examples of 19th century toy theaters that have survived to the present. And for our particular project, there are a series of archival absences surrounding this performance that would seemingly preclude the possibility of any form of reconstruction, big or small. So these multiple absences include the lack of material remains of the Opera House itself, or Alice's own toy theater, the lack of an extant script for Menken's play or Alice's adaptation. And finally, we don't actually know if Alice saw the play or if she went home and reenacted it. So what exactly is there to reconstruct? Well, it's these historical lacunae, however, that create the ideal conditions for a toy theater reconstruction. The toy theater is bricolage, utilizing whatever is at hand for reconstruction. Repurposing a wide array of visual media was common in the creation of toy theaters, in the same manner as related crafts like scrapbooking and extra illustrating books. Theater critic William Archer, reflecting on his childhood toy theater, recalls, "How well do I remember the glorious pageant which moved through my mind while I was tracing, sticking on pasteboard, coloring, and cutting out the costume plates in Knight's Pictorial Shakespeare." And so to enter the world of Alice Pike and her toy theater creations, we must play, iterate, and experiment, which means we need a laboratory, a playroom infrastructure that could support iterative exploration of possible performances the way little Alice might have. So in addition to the actual paper theater structure, my performance lab was stocked with facsimiles of dime novels, juvenile adventure books, illustrated newspapers, popular sheet music, and dozens of other reproduced primary sources. I wanted to emulate the library of the Pike family, who, as one of the richest families in Cincinnati, would have had access to virtually anything commercially available. I do want to point out real quick, though, as we're discussing a reimagining of Last of the Mohicans, there was never any intention for a public performance of this piece, of my toy reenactment of the reenactment. So there are quite a few reasons why I chose this particular piece, which time really won't permit me to get into today. But the highly racialized nature of all of the Native American source material makes a public performance inappropriate. Now, once I set up the lab, I had to consider the question, how dedicated to linearity and narrative coherence would a toy theater production have been? Essayist Amelia Soth writes, "It's easy to imagine how these stories would have expanded in the hands of the children who played with them, how the plots would zigzag, how the characters would migrate from one story to another, how scribbled additions would enrich the pre-drawn scenery." So you can see on the right, that's a traditional commercially available character sheet. And then on the left is, this is like a child's sketch notebook from the 19th century. So with this patchwork mentality in mind, I felt free to look beyond Cooper's original novel and Mencken's other writings for the specifics of the dialogue and the plotting of my adaptation. So with their melodramatic plots and evocative color illustrations, dime novels could have easily been used as a source of inspiration, just as much as the original novel or play. The genre was replete with stories featuring Native Americans and were often inspired by many of the same pioneers and American folk heroes that Cooper drew inspiration from. Now, moving on to music. For music, it seems reasonable to assume that little Alice had access to a piano and that one of her or herself could have banged out incidental music for the production. Her father was also an amateur flautist and quite indulgent, so it's possible he was a principal musician in Alice's miniature orchestra. Now, given her propensity for singing, which we know from her unpublished memoir, I thought Alice might also add in some popular songs instead of just the incidental music. And one particular tune of the day that I thought thematically worked and that I chose to include is called the Celebrated Death Song of the Cherokee Indian. Now, this was actually available in multiple editions, and one which included a flute part along with a vocal and piano accompaniment, making it a particularly attractive song for a father-daughter duet. And part of my research, I always like to point out my own particular biases. And so I may have also chosen this song because once, a very long time ago, I was a super cool teenage flute player myself. And that may have influenced my decision just a little bit to use this particular arrangement. No one screenshot that. Now, like the early toy theater artists in London, as we move on to scenic design here, like the toy theater artists in London, little Alice may have simply gone to the theater with a sketchbook and faithfully recorded what she saw of the Pike's Trap backdrops on a sketch pad. She may have looked elsewhere, though, to one of the world's finest scenic painters, Alessandro Sanquirico, for a more creative solution. So if Pike's Opera House, get the slide to change here. If Pike's, there we go. If Pike's Opera House was indeed modeled after La Scala, as Alice would later write in her memoir, the inspiration probably stemmed from one of Samuel Pike's trips abroad, where he could have acquired the book Nuovo Raccolta di Scene Teatrale, pardon my poor Italian, a collection of Sanquirico's scenic backdrops created for La Scala in the early 19th century. The pages of his book could have been removed and repurposed and served as a stand-in for the backdrop of The Last of the Mohicans. Now, here are just a few examples that I thought might have caught Alice's eye. Some for the resemblance to the American wilderness, and others that included characters clad in costumes that, while not Native American, certainly would have looked exotic and foreign to 6-year-old Alice. Now, as far as our toy theater actors, there would have been an endless array of material that Alice could have repurposed to create her actors, including the widely available commercial toy theater character sheets like we see on the left, and the extremely popular cartes de visite that were most popular actors would have sold as souvenirs at the theaters. I've developed something of an eBay addiction recently, tracking down all of these. I've bought dozens of them. So eBay supplied me with a wide variety of CDVs of Mencken, Adelina Patti, and many other stars of the era. I happily discovered that they were just the right size to repurpose as toy theater performers. Just so no one yells at me later, I've mostly photocopied these at the original size, so I'm not cutting up original CDVs. And we see here the striking image of the titular hero on the cover of Seth Jones' dime novel. This would have been a perfect stand-in for Natty Bumppo, who was the hero of Last Mohicans and Deerslayer, the whole collection of Fenimore Cooper's novels. And I sort of suppose that the cheap cost and the ephemeral nature of these editions, these dime novels, likely meant that Alice could have taken some scissors to a few of her brother's dime novel covers without causing too much trouble. Now, one figure that I realized was central to the restaging of this production was our star and author Ada Menken's horse. Oops. Oh, you saw the funny picture. So Last of the Mohicans, on its stage adaptation, its subtitle was actually called The Prairie Steed. And so the horse likely played a real live horse, just for the record, likely played a large role, as did the horse in Mazeppa, Menken's more famous horse drama. So I first cut out pictures from children's books and repurposed lithographic images from magazines of the era. But there is a precedent for a more daring casting choice for the titular prairie steed, set by August van Goethe, son of, Goethe, the famous Goethe, Johann, for his toy theatricals in Weimar in the late 18th century. In an apparent act of subversion, he would add a live cat during his performances for the sake of realism. Now, Alice Pike, whose chief interest of her childhood was actually not the arts, but her adoration of animals, may have recruited a household pet into her company to portray the horse. And I believe that is Punch of Punch and Judy fame on the cat there. Now, serendipitously, I recreated this bold staging choice on accident when my neighbor's cat, I want to point this out, this is not my cat, a neighbor cat, Shapes, he wandered into my house, jumped up onto my bookshelf where I store my toy theater belongings, and made his stage debut. If anyone wants, I have 400 other pictures of this cat destroying this toy theater. They're all equally adorable, and he eventually falls asleep on the stage. Now, as I delved further into this first practical project, I felt something was missing. I concluded there were two elements needed for the reconstruction of toy theaters that were in significant conflict with one another. One was the detailed knowledge of the historical context and performance practices of the era, all the good historian stuff. And then the second one was the childlike ability for free play. Now, my research for the project helped me develop a period sensibility, but one that was highly intellectualized and failed to capture the spontaneous surrealism of children's play. So is it possible to recover this type of play from the historical record through traditional research methodologies? Well, Seth Giddings writes in his book Game Worlds that the traces and products of play are visible, but they're less accessible, and they fail to capture its dynamism. Children rarely document their play in a way that's helpful to future generations, and their adult reflections are often unreliable. So with few contemporaneous sources to investigate historical play with, it must therefore be recreated in the present. With this in mind, I devised a toy theater project for my undergraduate students at Thomas More University. A quick note, they were not recreating a Last of the Mohicans, so you'll see a whole lot of variety of scenes and characters. They mostly ended up doing Shakespeare. Now, in its first iteration, we approached it like a found experience. Brianna Jackson, an Egyptologist and archaeogamer, describes this concept as the player finding themselves in a situation with seemingly no context, and thereby must explore the environment and seek information to slowly build an understanding and context of their situation. Essentially, they were given, my students were given reproduced historical materials without any intense history lesson or instructions on what to do. Now, once they became more acclimated to the toy theater and its components, they were given a more in-depth overview of the period and how toy theaters were actually used in the 19th century. We then began to play in a more structured environment. Now, this is the part I would love to expand on, but I want to keep everything in a tight, 20 minutes or so. So we started to play in a more structured environment based on the historical problem space framework for game analysis developed by a historian named Jeremiah McCall. And that allows you to sort of conceive of games and structure them with these four key elements. The first being a player agent that has scopes and powers. That player agent has explicit goals. The goals are then contained in a game world, in a virtual space. And then that game world elements fill the game world and function to either constrain or enable the player to seek their goals. There's still some kinks to be worked out in how I do this, but luckily I have new students every semester, so I get to keep running this experiment on them, especially in terms of goals and an end game, as it were. But this framework actually gave us boundaries and allowed for eliciting feedback but still encouraged broadly unrestricted play. Throughout the development of my students' toy theatricals, I observed several performance practices that could have been employed by toy theatrical practitioners in the 19th century, many that I had previously never considered. Several of the non-theater majors in particular instinctively read their own stage directions as dialogue aloud as they were performing the rest of the dialogue. And it stuck with me as something that any little kid in an era like unfamiliar with, a printed play script, something that they would have done. Also, there was a desire to switch from paper actor to human actor really seamlessly. That was really prevalent. They would step towards the audience and start delivering a monologue while totally ignoring the paper actor they held in their hand. There were also a weird and wide variety of special effects the students would sprinkle in, something that broke stage conventions in a particularly creative way. For instance, a group staged Julius Caesar, and I really regret not taking a picture of it, but they took out a pair of scissors and cut the paper Caesar in half when he was assassinated. Now, the students offered up a variety of insights in a reflective essay after their performances. One student writing that building the tiny theater was a little bit tricky, but it made me realize how much effort kids back then would have put into play with these theaters. The toy theaters for the casual observer may seem like child's play, as it were, but as this student in particular discovered, the play was quite serious and painstaking, or at least it could be. Now, some of the most interesting insights, though, came from a series of interviews where I questioned them about their own childhood experiences. So the students were about 18 to 22 in my class, but I gave them an interview about, what they could remember from their own childhood, reenacting scenes from TVs and movies. Now, one student told me that I would use the toys I had, whatever was at hand: football helmets, cars, characters, SpongeBob characters, and anything else to reenact all kinds of shows and movies. Another student said they would play with a lot of action figures and dolls, but we always pretended they were characters from our favorite video games. They were not always from the same games, but they were all involved in our little universe. Another went on to talk about Barbies and that she loved playing with Barbies growing up. But that being said, I never really played with the Barbies. I just had fun dressing them up and setting up their house and making up a dramatic storyline. But then after all the setup was done, I'd get bored and do something else. This actually echoes perfectly something Robert Louis Stevenson wrote in his very famous essay on toy theaters, A Penny Plain, Tuppence Colors. That really the fun and the passion was building it and painting the Tuppence plain or the penny plain version of the toy theater characters. And once he built them, he was basically done with it. And finally, we had another student tell me that the only reenactment I can think of was playing American Idol with my littlest pet shops. But I'd never actually seen the show before. I just knew the concept. And I liked making them dance to whatever songs I had on my iPod. So the way these students describe their childhood play mirrors how I envision 19th century toy theaters were in fact used. Some children would have created meticulously painted characters and maintained a realistic stage and stuck to the script, so to speak. But it seems likely that, like my students growing up in the early 2000s, the toy theater would have been used as a site for wildly free creative expression that was not just a carbon copy of shows seen on the stage. They were hybrid reenactments incorporating visual, dramatic, and musical elements from a wide range of media, with the theater space and the play serving as a loose scaffolding. The original play or movie is the impetus, but not the sole source for reenacting and reconstructing. So every toy theater production was part homage, part collage, but they still offered a connection to the real thing. David Robinson writes in the introduction to William West and the Regency Toy Theater, "For those who have fantasy enough to enter, like Alice, into this tiny wonderland of William West's imagery, there is a rare chance to catch just a whiff of the heady, haunted aura of the Regency Playhouse." So our toy theatricals can't facilitate a brick-by-brick reconstruction of the opera house or a step-by-step restaging of a 19th century play. But they can offer a chance to understand the embodied experience of spectators engaging with the opera house performances after the curtain comes down. And scene.
Nicely done, Philip. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Really fascinating, and some gorgeous images in the slides, not just the one of the naughty cat, which I think we all enjoyed. Thank you so much. So I'll ask you, Philip, to take down your slides. And now for those of us who've been listening, it's an opportunity for us to join the conversation as well, to ask questions, to leave comments. So as I said previously, if you have a question that you'd like to ask either Justin or Philip, or perhaps a question that they might both address, please feel free to raise your hand or to leave your question in the chat and we can come to you there. I can see lots of really interesting kind of themes and topics emerging across the papers. So we've been thinking about actually, yeah, different modes of reconstruction and recovery and immersive research practice. I'm really struck, Justin, that you're actually living in the school that you're researching, which must give all kinds of really interesting insights. I think you both called attention to really interesting questions around cultural value and values and changing cultural value and values. Very interesting potential conversations about childhood, youth, education, both formal and informal, and within popular culture, and the place of play within or outside of that. So I think loads that we can talk about here, and just keeping an eye on the chat for questions. So I think, well, I've got quite a few questions that I would like to ask actually, but I'm going to kick off with one of them, and maybe I'll have a second shot later on. So I wanted to come back actually to that question of changing cultural values and value, because I mean, we often focus on the place side of our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, but I think a sense of cultural value is one of the defining features of a shared community. And I'm very struck by how each of your projects gives us an insight into cultural value, sense of cultural prestige, cultural priority in the past that are in some cases very different from ours today. I mean, Philip, some of the plays that were hugely popular on the stage at Pikes, the examples that you were showing us today, very different perhaps from where we might kind of locate cultural value today. Those debates playing out in real time, Justin, in your research about cultural value and importance and prestige. I wondered, and I speak as someone who's taught literature of past periods, and I found difficulties here. Do you think there's a particular difficulty with trying to recover and engage with past formations of cultural value and prestige when those are very different from our own? What do you think is what makes it worthwhile, I suppose, to engage with those past formations of cultural value, even if they're different from our own? I hope that makes sense as a question. I don't know who wants to tackle that one first.
Yeah, you want me to go? No, I actually think, not to turn it around a little bit, but I think of Pike's Opera House as a sort of maybe the starting point of a certain set of cultural values around the importance of the arts that is still continuing on today in Cincinnati. So I've grown up in the Cincinnati area. I am on this doesn't mean anything to the Brits, but I'm in the Kentucky part of Cincinnati, right across the river. And for basically as long as Cincinnati has been around, they've been trying to I don't know, burnish their reputation amongst the well-educated and the artistic. Cincinnati was founded as a pork processing industrial center. And it was actually known as Porkopolis in the middle of the 19th century and in the decades before and during Pike's Opera House existence. And the arts were always used as something as a calling card for Cincinnati. That they would pour money and time and effort into punching above its weight, as they say, in the arts, as a way to get away from Porkopolis. So they basically renamed themselves the Queen City, so they wouldn't be Porkopolis. And the second Pike's Opera House burns down, they start rebuilding it. Just a few years after the rebuilt Pike's Opera House, they build what's called Cincinnati's Music Hall, which is this beautiful, like, neo-Gothic, amazing building. If you want to Google it, it's one of the coolest buildings, I think, in America. And it sort of culturally took the place of Pike's Opera House, which is kind of where this whole endeavor started, right? Because Music Hall is still there, and it is the centerpiece of the whole city, not just artistically, but I think culturally. And so in a lot of ways, I see what I'm trying to tease apart is how we could let something that was so culturally significant pass away. And one of the ideas I've always thought of is the idea didn't, it just is now sort of focused in other areas of the town. But I think, Cincinnati Cincinnati's history starts in 1875. If you look at the architecture of the city and if you look at what the museums focus on. So part of my whole endeavor has been to maybe revive the collective memory of Pike's Opera House and put it on the continuum, that continued from then till now, of a similar actual set of values.
So I love the way you flipped the question there, Philip, and you're kind of calling attention to the fact that although what was on the stage at Pikes might be different from what we might valorize today, it's this putting the arts at the center and kind of valuing the arts, which I think is something we all feel is important. Perhaps we could learn from 19th century Cincinnati today. Justin, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think so. In the work that I'm doing, it's a little different in the sense that the canon that these schools needed to commit themselves to remained for at least the period that I was talking about, and really through the turn of the 20th century remained really stable, because these schools had this instrumental motive of preparing students for college, and so their curriculum was kind of fit into this box of what are the colleges saying we need to do to satisfy admission requirements, and because those stayed constant certainly through the 1700s and really for much of the 1800s, with some additions here and there. It really wasn't until Adler, I forget his first name, has a book called The Battle of the Classics, that talks about at the end of the 1800s, how the colleges moved away from the dominance of Latin and Greek, particularly with Greek in the 1880s and 90s, kind of fell out of vogue. And then by the early 20th century, and 1930s, Latin was dropped as a requirement at the elite colleges, Harvard, Yale. But so from the 1700s, or really 1600s, until then, they had to engage with the same set, a growing set, but the same essential set of texts, Cicero, Virgil, and such like classical authors. But so when you can't change what you're engaging with, from the Boston Latin School to Phillips Academy, or whatever, the thing that I found in my research is the way that these schools were engaging with those same texts, or the way that they were teaching them, was emphasizing really different things. So like one clear example would be, at Andover, what you see starting to happen, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, is this valorization of the discipline aspect of learning Latin and Greek, of like what we would call, well, what the Victorians would call, gerund grinding. That was the term it got, and now we call it kind of grammar grinding. That became part and parcel of the Andover experience in a way that surprisingly it wasn't, as much, in the mid 1700s at the Boston Latin School. And part of that discipline, that was really important at Andover teaching, this language, was that you could connect the classical discipline, or the discipline of learning the classical languages, to living this disciplined life as a Christian. And so what they're doing when they're reciting their, I mean, like there's a great student reminiscence, at Andover where a kid who went to the school actually was part of the first class at Phillips Academy in the 1770s. He said, I was really well prepared for Andover because I'd spent so much time with the Westminster Catechism, learning, memorizing things that I had no way to understand, but just grinding them into my brain. And that really helped me do what I was supposed to be doing at Andover. And so you see them using the same thing that they have to use, which is this classical canon, but using it in different ways to achieve their particular desired ends.
That's fascinating. The kind of moral dimension of learning the classics. They might be kind of immoral and pagan, but the moral dimension of that discipline is really fascinating. I wonder if I could ask a question that brings us back a little bit more towards place. So this is something that Philip's already touched on, but Philip, you might be able to say a little bit more, but perhaps Justin, I could start with you this time. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the the role that the Phillips Academies played in making their places, in defining the places where they existed. You use the analogy of Eton in England, which has really kind of shaped the place around it. Might think of other large public schools in England, or private schools in the States, that really have an impact on a place, a role in placemaking, on shaping and defining places. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see the Phillips Academies doing that? Do they have an impact on the settlements and the culture of the places around them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think like the best inroads into answering that would be like just thinking about the pure geography of these places, comparing them to where they geographically are versus where the Boston Latin School was. So the Boston Latin School is in the colonial metropolis, which at the first census is 1790 and of the U.S. And I think Boston has like 18,000 people, or maybe close to 20,000 people in it. Andover, 25 miles north, is a town of like 2,000, mid-sized town at that period. And Exeter is like 1,800, so similar size. Now Andover is 3 times as large as Exeter nowadays. But back then they were similar sized towns. Exeter is still a little bit more outlying. And the difference there in terms of the geography of the main school in the mid 1700s was a city school that was drawing from primarily Boston and some outlying, little bit of the outlying towns, to now the academy model in these rural, semi-rural towns that are outside of the metropolis that require a half day's journey to get to, that a lot of students are starting to live in, not dorms yet. Dorms kind of are a Victorian invention of the mid 1800s, but boarding with residents of the town, coming from a wider variety of areas. And so like the difference there, and this actually moves away a little bit from religion and toward politics, which are connected. But so Mark Boonshoft, who wrote like aristocratic education in a book on aristocratic education in early America, and he talks about the academies as moving away from this sort of parochial, interestingly, from a parochial town-based government structure to a national, regional or national sort of federalist idea of elite political formation. And so the idea that these schools were in outlying towns that people had to come to, they were coming from various areas into this sort of secluded, remote place. And they were secluded there for 3 years while they got their education, and then they went out into the world. It was kind of this idea that we were creating, or the American elite formation was such that kids would go away from the bad influences of the city, learn kind of the same thing at these different sort of remote locations, and then come back in. And so I think that pure geography, and Boonshoft explains it way better than I can, in terms of how that ties into this National Federalist Program. That's one really big difference there. I don't know, that kind of answers your question, maybe, or maybe
Yeah,
not.
no, that's fascinating, and that sense of kind of education. And I think we see that in some of the English public school tradition as well, kind of school being a sort of a retreat, almost a kind of a pastoral, and some apart from the business of life, but where you kind of prepare for adult life. Thank you so much, Philip. I'm going to ambush you slightly and nuance the question a little bit for you, because you've already said a little bit to us about the defining role that Pikes played in 19th century Cincinnati, and kind of shaping and fashioning the city then. But of course it doesn't exist now. And I wondered if, you can add anything you want to on that, but I wonder what potential you see for the memory, the heritage, the commemoration of Pike's Opera House to do that kind of placemaking and place shaping and defining work in Cincinnati today. And then I'll come to my colleague Justin for the next question. You're still muted, Philip.
Yes.
There you go.
So, yeah, I have this firm belief that Cincinnati, like I kind of mentioned before, Cincinnati's history starts in like 1875. That's where you see all the architecture. Actually, everything that's been preserved is from the the generation after Pike's Opera House. And of course, there was this. It was one of the biggest cities in America for 20 years before the 1870s. This was a hub of the Underground Railroad movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe lived here, the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there is this rich sort of pre-1870s history that gets a little bit ignored because there is such an abundance of architecture left over from the 1870s to the early 20th century. And so, yeah, as I look towards like, my goal in the beginning is like, how do we all know about this place now? How do we revive the memory in the minds of the people in Cincinnati, and what do we get if that happens? And I don't know. It's something I think every single day I brainstorm some sort of like project. I share birthday week with my girlfriend, and we went and ate downtown just a couple days ago. So really just like 2 miles from my house, but I don't necessarily go downtown all the time. And the restaurant we were eating at, just the seat we were sitting at, and we were near the window, you could look at what was Pike's Opera House. And now it's a 20-story like insurance building. But there is this, and it's a literal, but it's metaphorical too for me. There is a gap between buildings. So the buildings there now, none of them were there in the 1860s. They don't line up exactly where the old buildings were. But Pike's Opera House was definitely in the middle of the block. And so in the middle of the block is basically empty space. There is nothing. I don't know why in this huge, bustling downtown, there is just sort of empty space. There's a bench, but it's like 40 feet wide. And I look at that all the time and I think sort of about the potential for bringing something back. Literally there, but sort of it's that sort of blank space there is always sort of calling.
Well, that's the post-PhD project. That's Philip. That's the kind of the civic regeneration and renewal project that you'll have to move to next. That would be hugely exciting. Thank you. We've got 2 questions waiting. First of all, I'm going to go to my colleague Justin, and then we'll move to Richard. So Justin, over to you.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks. I was just reflecting a little bit more on the way that both of your themes actually draw on European and perhaps specifically Italian allusions, connections, and thinking about place. I was starting to wonder to what extent is there a kind of imagined evocation and of international place, as well as the kind of localized sense of place that you've been talking about. How important is that? Some of the quotes that you were using, Justin, were kind of very dismissive of some of that, but nonetheless, it's clearly very influential in some ways. So yeah, I wonder if I could just ask you both to reflect on kind of international place or transnational place as well as local place.
Yeah, that's great and interesting in the sense that like I mean my topic is a very American one, but it's also a very transatlantic. It's Atlantic history. So Caroline Winter in the Cultural Classicism, which is like the kind of landmark book on American imagining, understanding of classics and she's talking about the colleges in particular. But she talks about a shift over the 19th century from like the classics as words to the classics as worlds. So from words to worlds, which is catchy. I wish I came up with that. And so here in the era that I'm talking about, it's still very much in the words phase, right? Like first American grand tourists to Italy and Greece were like early 18, like Nicholas Biddle went and then he came back and he designed the Bank of the United States or whatever off of some ruins. But that really hadn't happened. Like Samuel Phillips never would have. Never left basically Massachusetts. Right. So he wasn't thinking as much, I don't think, about like the space and place of Italy or of certainly Greece. But they were definitely in dialogue, intellectual dialogue with what was going on in England at the time. And so that whole grammar school tradition, right, like the Boston Latin School, the historian of the Boston Latin School, Pauline Holmes, she has this theory that is kind of half-baked, but like it's nice to think about that the Boston Latin School was actually like founded upon this original Boston Latin School in Boston, England, which is somewhere in England. You guys can tell me where that is. But there's not necessarily great evidence that that was the case, but it definitely, that 7-year structure, and even the text that they were reading was straight out of like Colet and Erasmus at the St. Paul's School in the 1570s, and that kind of humanist godly mix of that. So they're operating clearly within this English humanist tradition that, as I understand it, is kind of a blend of like Northern European humanism and Italian more secular humanism that created kind of that grammar school movement. And now Phillips and Pearson are kind of modulating that with this New England Congregationalist inflection. So totally, there's a lot of stuff going on internationally. And like there's a case to be made that America is part of the Republic of Letters at this period of time, even though maybe you guys in your more enlightened coast side of the Atlantic wouldn't think so. So yeah.
Brilliant. Great question, Justin. Fascinating answer as well. Other Justin. Philip, do you want to respond to that? I mean, I see a bit of that material world building in the architecture, Justin, of the academies. And Philip, I know Pikes prided itself on some of the Italian influence to the architecture and the staging, didn't it, I think?
Yeah, from the architectural perspective, for sure, Pikes, there are a couple of mentions in the archive that it was modeled off of La Scala. What exactly that means, we don't know. The exterior is so very different. But we have no pictures or no drawings of the interior of Pikes. So I'm assuming the interior was modeled off of La Scala. And I mean, I think the easy answer for something about like theater and performance is that the stage is a liminal space that is connected to a network of not only national performers, but of international performers. Adelina Patti was one of her very first like big concerts she gave as she was ascending to 19th century operatic dominance was in Pike's Opera House. It was her little let's get ready for London tour in the early 1860s that she did in preparation for going to Europe. And, you know, we were seeing the same thing that they were seeing in Charleston, that they were seeing in Boston, they were seeing in New York, than they would see in the rest of the world. Basically, all theaters back in the were receiving theaters, right? They hosted, they might have had a residential company, but they were built to receive these big touring stars. So in a lot of ways, Pikes was the, you know, it was the like the nexus of like a flow of international performers, you know, from opera to theater, even like paintings and things that would tour on, you know, into one of the smaller little venues at Pikes. Yeah, and even just with the toy theaters are actually more of a British pastime, British and German. And if you want to read my full dissertation one day, you know, like where they may have pulled in little elements to create a toy theater in Cincinnati, they would have been like imported, you know, so it would have been based off of architecture from London or from Berlin or from Copenhagen to cobble together to create a facsimile of a Cincinnati opera house, which itself was based off of an Italian opera house.
I love that idea of the stage as a liminal space, like a kind of threshold connected to other places and bringing into focus networks and flows. And I love your responses to Justin's question about kind of staging other places and cultures in these sites. Really fascinating. Thank you. Richard, it's lovely to see you with us this evening. I'll hand over to you for your question.
Right, thank you. This is a rather more basic architectural question, I think, than the what we've just had. But I mean, first question to Justin is simply to tell me a bit more about the architecture of these places and how far it was thought that you needed a classical architecture to go along with a classical education. So that's the sort of the starting point. But then to kind of mix it up a bit, the thing that opera houses and boarding schools have in common is that people live somewhere else and they go to them. So again, we have to think about the architectural spaces from which they come to the schools, and are they very different kind of spaces that people are sending their children to? And in the case of the opera house, do we know, we may not know what the opera house looked like inside. Do we know what Alice Pike's own house looked like, where the Pike family lived in Cincinnati, and what the disjuncture was between going from home to the opera house and then recreating the opera house back at home?
Mhm.
Fantastic. Okay, looks like you're ready to dive in there, Philip.
Yes. So the Pike home is no longer standing, but we do have a pretty like vivid descriptions of it. It was one of the, it was definitely one of the nicest houses in Cincinnati. There's some vivid description of it. It had one of the first like indoor bathtubs in Cincinnati or something, and which was important enough to make some sort of Cincinnati history book 100 years ago. It would have been a very grand house on the scale of Cincinnati in the 1860s. We do also know that her father later bought the Burnett House, which was one of the most palatial hotels in the country that was in Cincinnati. And so he kept an office there as well. They all would have been, the house, the hotel, Pike's Opera House, would have all been within just a couple blocks of each other in the proper downtown of Cincinnati at the time. And for as nice of the house would have been back then, it certainly would have been dwarfed in scale and size and grandeur by the Opera House. I've been watching The Gilded Age on HBO. If anyone would see that the new show by Julian Fellows. And there was no house that looked like Downton Abbey. Nothing like that existed in Cincinnati for many, many decades following this. So it would have been a much more, it would have been a nice house for today, but it would not have been a palace kind of thing. But I don't know. But that building is long gone. The Burnett House is long gone. She does describe, if we want to get into what her actual toy theater was, it was something she built. It was homemade, and it was built on like the parlor and in her little child's sitting room. Talked about putting it in a windowsill and things like that. Trust me, I've been in the archives trying to figure out how wide would the window have been. Were they facing east, and they would get the sun in the morning, and but and in the basic scale, though, I think going from home, even in the richest, nicest house in Cincinnati, to the Opera House was like going to outer space for her. And she did grow up to be, we don't get into it too much, but she is an amazing artist. She, as a painter, and she created ballets for Pavlova. She wrote suffragette dramas that were staged on the U.S. Capitol in the early part of the 20th century. She really did it all. She created DC almost single-handedly as an arts town. Just an amazing person, and it does all go back to the Opera House. She pretty explicitly says that later in life. Yes, that was a long answer to your question.
No, fascinating, Philip. Thank you. Justin, you had a few things to get your teeth into. So, again, that question about what spaces are people coming from to these academies. And then Richard's question, do you need classical architecture for a classical education? And can you tell us more about the architecture?
Yeah, that's like, Richard, it's like you're a plant in the audience, which I swear you're not, because I have like a whole year of like abortive research on boarding school architecture, because that was actually going to be my original dissertation topic, was the architecture of these places. I'm an architecture dilettante, so I didn't have the expertise to actually create a dissertation out of that. So I switched into something that was a little more comfortable for me, and went to more of just a straight classical textual reception topic, which is is more of a background. But I do have a lot of useless expertise on the architecture of these schools for that reason. And so kind of two points or eras. Maybe I'll go with the more recent one first, and then back to the era that I was talking about. So the architecture of these campuses now, and I'll talk particularly about Andover because I think that's the architecturally most interesting one. It's dominated by this plan that this architect Charles Platt drew up in the 1920s and 30s. And so Platt was a very prominent academic architect, architecturally conservative, and he was kind of the dean of the Colonial Revival School of Architecture, Georgian Revival, so brick, some columns on the front, symmetrical, proportional. And this was different in the 1930s than kind of the vogue at that time was starting to be. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright is making Falling Water in the 1930s. And he's in an exhibition with Philip Johnson and whoever else in the MoMA for or maybe the Met. I don't know if the MoMA was whatever, wherever that big architectural exhibition in the 30s was. So this is a very staid and conservative architectural plan that harks back to this imagined idea of colonial America. And that's what the plan, it's changing a little bit now. I go back every year, coach against them wrestling, and I see the campus changing and getting more and more modern, but it's still dominated by that Platt plan. But to go back even further to the time that's relevant or close to relevant to what I was talking about, so Andover in the early 1800s became home to the Andover Theological Seminary, which was a graduate school, kind of like the first graduate school in America. And it was to train Orthodox Congregationalist ministers. The idea, you go to Andover, to Phillips Academy as a kid, you go to Yale, Congregationalist Yale, as for undergraduate education, then you go back to Andover to the Theological Seminary and become an Orthodox minister from there. And so the architecture of the Andover Theological Seminary, which then Phillips Academy was right next to that. And then when the Theological Seminary left in the early 20th century, then they took over the space. And then Platt did what he did. He moved buildings, he changed things around. But the architecture of the Theological Seminary, the most prominent like postcard view of campus was what was called Seminary Row. And it was 3 buildings, Georgian or Federalist style brick rectangles, 1, 2, 3. And that was modeled after probably Yale Row, which was a row of I think 5, and they were oriented differently, like one rectangle and the other one and the other. And but it was the same idea: 5 rows in a building, or 5 buildings in a row. And that was, I think, John Trumbull, actually the painter, who came up with that architectural plan. And there was a similar one. So we think it could be modeled after Yale, but we know there was some inspiration from Brown because the trustees of Phillips Academy and the Theological Seminary, same board of trustees, went to visit Brown when they were planning their new campus addition in the early 1800s. And same idea, a row of buildings. I don't know how many there were at Brown, but the idea that this theological seminary would really replicate the building plan of the Congregationalist Yale College, as opposed to Harvard Yard, which is a quadrangle. Andover didn't go for that, and there's probably an ideological reason there, why they opted for the architecture of the campus that matched their theological belief, rather than the architecture of a campus that was going in a different theological direction. So again, I might have missed something in that answer, but and it was probably too long-winded. But there's your architecture.
Justin, you seemed beautifully poised to answer that question. That was really fascinating.
Thank you so much. It seemed like he was a plant. Like I swear.
I can confirm, ladies and gentlemen, that was not a plant. But brilliant answer. We've got time for, I think, one last really quick question. We're approaching 7 o'clock. Mark, it would be great to take your question. Mark Freeman.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Nice to meet you, Justin, and happy birthday, Philip. This is not about architecture at all. This is a question for Philip, though. And what struck me very typically was how expensive some of this stuff on eBay was when you showed your slide. So there's some collectible stuff here. So I suppose, I mean, you're using toy theatre in a different way in a kind of educational settings, but is there a sort of community of collectors? Well, one thing, when I studied historical pageants, I got quite surprised and excited to find there's a big community of people who collect memorabilia from that theatrical phenomenon. And so is there a kind of big community of toy theatre collectors and reenactors, and is there any interesting features of that community that it will be interesting to share with us?
There are quite a lot of toy theater aficionados in the world. It's not a fully underground movement. They're there. A lot in Europe, though. I would say it's a much bigger deal in like Denmark, Germany, Spain, but especially like Britain. You know, London is the progenitor of the juvenile drama, as they call it. And like America did not have the toy theater industry that London did. So the toy theater, the juvenile drama, that is sort of the basis of at least the beginning of this idea, where it was modeled off of, like, you'd go to Drury Lane and they would create a toy theater based on Drury Lane, and based off of the actors. Those actors would, in those costumes, would show up in the character sheets. That culture did not really exist in America, and thus begins my initial disappointment on this as a way to reenact Pike's Opera House. I thought, oh, surely they made one of these at Pike's Opera House. So I had to dig really, really, really deep to start to find the history on homemade toy theatricals. So there is definitely a very wide community of toy theater performers. Pollux in London, give a shout out to them. They're holding down the toy theater heritage sort of single-handedly in the UK. But there is not exactly that sort of affinity group I would want, or collectors over here. My next two chapters actually are not toy theater. They start to get into like scrapbooking and extra illustrated editions and things like that. And that's actually where the expense is about to come in, Mark, because I'm buying actual like empty photo albums from the Civil War, and then buying pictures to fill them to create my own sort of faux family archive of the war. And so there's definitely the interesting thing about this project is that it's not about the Civil War, but it's about the years of the Civil War in a city that was strategically, culturally extremely significant for the Civil War. So there's collectors groups for every little thing for this.
That's really interesting. Thank you for the question, Mark. Great question. And I can't say too much yet, but plans are afoot for Philip to hopefully run an interactive toy theatre based event at the Institute of Historical Research in the autumn. So if we do have some fans and aficionados and reenactors here, keep an eye out for that. I just feel like we could keep on talking for the rest of Philip's birthday and the rest of the day for all of us on the wonderful topic that we've had this evening in response to the wonderful papers from Justin and Philip, but I need to draw the seminar to a close at this point. So first of all, please join me in thanking Justin and Philip again for their excellent papers. Really appreciated. Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful and generous responses to questions. Thanks to all of you for joining us and for your questions. Thank you to Ruth Satter, my colleague, who leads on this events series and puts the programme together.